Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the board of Nordic Innovation House, a very warm welcome to today's Nordic Talk event, Are We Wasting Value? My name is Annette Jorgensen. I am head of public diplomacy and partnerships at the Danish Embassy here in Singapore. And as you have guessed, also a board member of Nordic Innovation House here in Singapore. So this event today has been made possible through a collaboration between the Nordic embassies and Nordic trade promotion offices in Singapore, Nordic Innovation House, and with funding from something called Nordic Talks. And Nordic Talks is a project that is under the Nordic Council of Ministers. It's dedicated to address the biggest global challenges through conversations between experts from the Nordics and around the world. And the purpose of Nordic Talks and also today is actually to inspire us all to act better and act for a more sustainable future. So that's why we're here today, for all of us to act for a better and more sustainable future, basically. Sustainability is very close to our hearts in the Nordics, and that's also why the ministers of all the Nordic countries, the prime ministers in 2019, they decided that by 2030, this is going to be the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff in this that I'm not going to bore you with. If you're really interested, then you can look it up online. And today we're in Singapore. And the sustainability journey has also started in Singapore, but I think it's safe to say that maybe not as fast as the journey has been in the Nordics. Denmark has been fortunate to work very closely with the government in Singapore since 2014 on environment and water, where we have an MOU. But we've also seen with the Singapore Green Plan for 2030 that the process has really picked up in Singapore. We see a lot of interesting things going on within circular economy, which is also the topic today, regulation-wise, but that in the Nordics has definitely been a big driver for sustainability and for doing more recycling. A good example, I think, is the bottle return scheme that was just announced in March this year in Singapore. That means that by 2025, we're all going to be recycling bottles in Singapore as well. I am very, very excited about today's event. I'm very passionate about waste, and I actually love sorting through my waste and recycling, which may seem strange, but it's. I think we had another seminar where the Swedish ambassador said it's almost like meditative. It's like mindfulness when you're sorting through your waste. So I'm very excited about today's topic. We have a very skilled panel and moderator from the Nordics and Singapore. And I look forward to exploring if we are wasting value in Singapore by not recycling all the waste that we could. Can we actually do more with the waste? And is there also a business case for doing so? And as Jackie has already mentioned, there will be some time for Q&A. So please remember all your good questions. And I look very much forward to the networking session afterwards, where there'll be some small drinks and appetizers and lots of good talk about recycling and waste and sustainability. Thank you for coming. The floor is yours, Conrad.
Thank you, Annette. Good afternoon, everyone. Conrad is my name. I will start asking my panelists to take the stage. Juliana, Leif, Lawrence, please. Are we wasting value? I think it was a little bit of a provocation that the three of us came up with, or the four of us came up with as we were preparing for this panel. One thing that we really would like to address today, and I think we were discussing before, is as we have, actually, if you're thinking about the panelists, then I will let them introduce themselves very shortly. But we have representatives from the upstream, midstream-ish, and downstream. So when we're looking at the waste stream, we actually are able to understand whether there are trade-offs and tensions that we need to address as we start taking note of the value of waste. So I will let you introduce first, and then Leif and Lawrence, and then I will set the scene, and then we will kick off the conversation. So Juliana, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Juliana Ding. I am the head of sustainability for Rambo Asia Pacific. So my role in this as the head of sustainability is really to drive Rambo's sustainability agenda internally as well as for our clients, and in terms of what we provide to our clients and solutions and our value propositions in sustainability.
My name is Leif Vebenstad. I'm CEO and chairman of Johnson Chemical. It's a chemical company within clean tech. So we reduce emission of NOx, SOx by increasing the efficiency of the combustion at any solid fuel.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Lawrence. I'm a co-founder of a company called Environmental Solutions Asia, based out of Tuas in Singapore. So what do? We essentially a waste management company that is involved in the circular economy. That's just to make the company sound sexier. But we're essentially a waste management company, and I think to Corrado's point, it's extremely glad to be here, to be kind of a downstream. Yeah, we're trying to close the loop like that. But it's great to be here to share, what some of the pain points we have in the industry.
Yeah. And Corrado is my name. I'm the managing director of Taya Consulting, being a sustainability consultancy firm headquartered in Singapore 20 years ago. So among the first one to establish sustainability. And at the time, as you can imagine, it was more by persuasion than regulation. And since we have up, mid, and downstream, I will try to facilitate the conversation so we get a little bit of sense from all of you. And just to set the scene for are we wasting value? I think one thing that was fascinating for me in my work was how do we actually measure sustainability performance by looking at something like waste? And I think one of the definition that I like, that I actually came across, defining sustainability performance is actually at the intersection of what is environmental, social, and governance. That is clear. But even more importantly, is it equitable? So if we're thinking about any circular models, can we answer the questions whether they are equitable from a social aspect? Are they meaningful also from a societal governance perspective? And are they viable economically? And I think the intention of the conversation today is really, where are the trade-offs? What are the things that we need to actually understand and take note of as we start assessing the value of waste? Because that's the only way, in my mind, where we can actually start having a better understanding of what is needed for that business case to be viable. Is that business case equitable? Is that business case meaningful? And I think around those three dimensions, we will have the conversation. So let me kick off with Leif, midstream. So if you're thinking about trade-offs and you're thinking about waste optimization as part of your waste to energy and what you just mentioned in the introduction, where do you see trade-offs today?
The trade-offs goes like, first of all, I said that Singapore made a good choice 60 years ago to start waste to energy incineration instead of landfill. It's obviously because you don't have room for landfill. It's a very easy solution. The trade-offs, pro and cons, like waste to energy. There are two very good reasons for doing it. One thing is you get rid of the waste. And the other thing is that you create power. Because I think of municipal waste as a good raw materials that can be used to produce power. The trade-off is that the waste to energy very often give high pollution to the air. But that is actually a solvable problem from the technology side. Having a waste to energy without polluting any harmful emission, that is not a technology problem, it's a financial problem. So that is the trade-off. And whether the circular economy will change the waste energy. And yes, it will a lot, because when you do start recycling of resources, which is part of circular economy, you will see that in Singapore, it will happen the same as happening all over the world. All the valuable fuel parts of the waste will disappear. If there is no paper, no cardboard, no wood, no plastic in the fuel, you need much more fuel to create the calorific value goes down a lot. And if you compare the calorific value of waste, I don't know where Singapore is, but in Europe, the calorific value is 2,400, while in India, the waste is 1,200, which means that you need a double amount of fuel to create the same power in India as you do in Europe. Which means that when, not if, but when this happens in Singapore, you will probably not have enough waste to operate the waste to energy, existing ones.
Yeah, so Leif, you're basically saying we need to waste more because that business model will be. So if we are going upstream, Juliana, and trying to challenge then the midstream, because you will be asking for more waste if you're running a waste to energy optimization. Upstream, where do you see this going? I mean, we discussed during our when we met, regulation, education, redesigning product, but also where do you see upstream some of the trade-offs?
Before I go there, Rambo also does a lot of waste to energy facilities, so I wouldn't say that it's not a solution, but it's one of the solutions perhaps, but yeah, not perhaps the first one. So I would like to think more on eco-design. Rambo is already helping a lot of our clients in the manufacturing of new products and looking at the eco-design, how we could actually remove hazardous materials in the actual product or the packaging material, so that when it comes to the end of life of the product, there is more options for reuse, repurpose, recycling, remanufacture, versus than just waste to energy, where that's an easy solution, sort of. But to take out all the toxic materials, to really look at the supply chain of these materials that we're using, so that we can actually be able to do the 3 Rs around it rather than it going to waste, and make it a resource rather than.
I'm kind of keen to understand upstream, because you're saying in this eco design, it will also require you that you are aligning some of the interests between private, public, government, because government will solve the problem as in Singapore. But how do you see that alignment or realignment to happen? Is there any, it is more regulation that is needed? Is this more education that goes into eco design?
I think one of the things that if you go back a little bit about the concept of the circular economy, I think we all have to play. We have only limited resources, and the linear trajectory of our consumption, it cannot continue forever. So I think circular economy is the answer to some of the issues we have with waste. It's a decoupling of our waste, our resource consumption from the economic activity. So I think a circular economy provides that opportunity for us to decouple those two. And I think that's pretty much also part of the agenda of the EU Green Deal. If you all are aware of the European Green Deal, it talks about circular economy, and also the driver for it is, of course, the restated 2020 circular economy action plan. Mm-hmm. And also, I think with the EU taxonomy and also with the new more eco-design regulations around it, I think there's a lot of drivers to have us all do our part in the whole sort of from the consumption, the manufacturing consumption to the end of life product. Yeah. So yeah, so I think we all have a part to play. Regulations is one part, but I think as the planet is going to an area of like where we are falling off the cliff in terms of climate change, I think we will need to do our part.
We'll get back to the regulation. Lawrence, how does it sound? So upstream, there is a lot of things happening, regulation and taxonomies, EU Green Deal, eco-design. Midstream will fix the problem. And you gave me waste as long as they have a high calorific value, good. Downstream, what's the business case?
I think the challenge in Singapore is, and I'm using Singapore as an example, I think in most economies, I think in Asia, the infrastructure was built, the entire supply chain and infrastructure around waste management was probably 20, 30 years. And it's built for even longer than 20, 30 years ago. It's a very linear based kind of infrastructure. I think the challenge right now is how do you take a primarily linear with lots of investment behind it and kind of make it circular? I think that's the biggest challenge. I think as a company, my company was kind of founded 20 odd years ago. We really looked at pivoting the business maybe 3 years ago, actually during the pandemic. And a large part of where our mission was really to look at, can we actually regenerate the waste that's coming off industries and recirculating that back into the economy? So I wouldn't say that we have the best business case, but there's something working. So I'm going to share that. And Corrado, to your question, are there really business cases out there at this point in time? I really don't think so, at least not in the Singapore context. I'm not sure about Europe, and I've been too busy trying to study what's happening outside of Singapore, because Singapore has a big problem with that. So I think, let me give you a few examples, right? And I think the first example is the wafer fabs in Singapore used to have a challenge. There are two major types of waste that come off wafer fabs. HF sludges, very, very, very wet HF sludges. And there's a lot of acids that come off as well. A lot of acids. It's all part of the wafer fab kind of fabrication process. And I think what we have done, I think we have NEA among us. So I don't want to quote NEA here. But NEA recently announced in the 2022 statistics that there was increase in sludge recycling by 2%, from 9 to 11%. And when I looked at the numbers, while the quantum is not large, and I looked at my own numbers and I go, how much have I actually regenerated and circulated? I kind of go, maybe we have kind of moved the needle by 1 or 2%. So to me, actually, I feel quite happy about it, because that was what we wanted to do. So we basically take HF sludges and we regenerate them into two different materials. One is fluorspar, which kind of ceramic industries can use, because they don't need raw fluorspar, essentially. They can take the quality that we make out of HF sludges from the wafer fabs. That's one. And then for acids, we use that for our own purpose, because we leach the acids. Again, they come to us at about 60-70% concentration. We only need 5% to be able to leach metals out of waste, which we do. And once we refine the metals, we will then resell the metals back into the economy. So I think the first is I think it's working. We're still small, but I think we're moving the needle a little bit by bit. And I think that's important. Secondly is we intentionally invested in gasification technology 2 years ago. So I'm sorry, I had to steal your waste. I think that if you look at Singapore versus the other countries, wood waste is a nuisance in Singapore. Pellets, because we are a shipping hub, so we get a lot of pellets that come in from everywhere. These pellets are typically incinerated. They are thrown into incinerators, great calorific waste. But we take them actually at a cheaper rate as compared to them sending to incinerators, and we actually gasify the wood to create thermal energy. So, and why do we consciously do that? Because a lot of our processes require thermal energy. So effectively, what we have really done is, the concept is waste treating waste. I'd like to share an example, right? So there was a recent, for those of you who have visited in Marina Bay Sands, there was a drinks event last week, I don't know, wine and all that. And I won't quote the company. So one of the companies, they built up, obviously, that booth with a lot of wood. Typically, what they would have done with the wood is send it to the incinerator. They decided to send it to us because we were able to tell them how much energy we have generated out of the wood waste. And as part of generating that energy, again, sorry for stealing your waste, how much avoidance of diesel have we actually effected? if I look at our facilities, I can't remember the numbers at the top of my head, but I think we basically took in about 185 tons of wood waste, which equates to about 12,000 terajoules of energy. And we avoided something like 215 tons of diesel because we don't use diesel except for our trucks. So I think, not selling the company, but I'm sharing that I think if every company thinks like that, every waste management company thinks like that, I think the world will be in a much better place.
And I think, Lawrence, again, it's fascinating that you're saying we start competing for waste. So when we're looking at upstream, midstream, downstream, is there going to be a loser? Or are they all going to be winners?
I would like to say that company should have thought about designing it so that it could be used or manufactured.
Yeah.
I was just thinking as well, an example would be a product leasing, where put the manufacturer of that product and lease it to this event.
Could be, and then rebuild it.
And rebuild it again. And that would have solved the problem. No waste, only resource.
So upstream, you are back to your point.
And sorted.
But,
It's for you.
yeah, no, I mean, it looks like
Difficult to be in the middle.
it looks like the loser is in the middle. Life.
Yeah,
Do you think so?
Yeah, and it's correct. That's the way it should be because it's too much waste. And whatever, you should try to reuse all the waste that's available, that's possible. Of course, the waste incineration of the remaining, because what you have left then for incineration is all the awful stuff.
Yeah.
But then you have to build a waste to energy power plant that can adapt to lower quality fuel, lower volume, and it will end up that it will be a fight for the waste as fuel. And Ryan told me that in Amsterdam now, they are running the waste to energy on 30% because there is not enough waste. I got a request from a Chinese group of waste to energy power plants. And I asked them, do you have capacity to produce more power? They say, yeah, none of their waste to energy power plants are running on full capacity. So already today, there's not enough waste. And okay, Singapore has started waste to energy very long time ago, and it's not very good at segregation of waste. Yeah. But when they fix that problem, and that's not if, that's when, yeah, then it will be a fight for waste as a resource.
I guess that's where we can play a part is segregation. It's very poor in Singapore, and I think the recycling rate is very low.
Yeah, extremely
less than 40%.
Yeah. And life is not intention that we're putting you in the middle.
No. So I'm used to it.
don't be squeezed. But I'm just fascinating. If we go back to this concept of sustainability performance as being the intersection of what is viable, meaningful, equitable. Lauren, starting with you, looking at downstream. So if you're looking at the business case bottom up, liability we just discussed. So you don't see the business case really. Yeah. Meaningful, I think we probably agree that makes sense. Is it equitable? If you're thinking about, I think we had a very interesting conversation about economic performance or economic value. What do you see happening in terms of equitable?
If you look at the definition of a company, if you're a business student, it is returning shareholder value. I hope that one day business schools will teach returning environmental value as well. That's a side kind of way to answer your question. I think, the value of waste, the output that we're creating out of that waste has to be somewhat equitable in order for us to achieve both economic and environmental prosperity. And I like to use the word prosperity versus economic kind of benefits or profits. And again, I'm going to use an example. So plastic is great calorific value. You can turn it into energy, and electricity and so on. But I think that the more we can get out of the thinking of just crude oil, because burning waste is similar to if I'm burning fossil for energy. It's just another calorific value commodity. Is how much more can we derive from that waste? And I like to quote an example. And again, I don't think this is absolutely. It's still in its early stages. So I would kind of say it's kind of I see some of the green shoots. Is our collaboration with Nanomatics, which Greg and Andre founded. And just to give you an example, for every kilogram of output that comes from waste plastics, if I were to rely on the economic value of what I'm producing, which is actually circular pyrolysis oil, and I won't share the value, right, because it's private and confidential. I will use 1x as an example. If the value of that oil that I'm producing is 1x, Greg's technology will turn it to 100 times that value. And look, I think this is extremely important because for economic prosperity reasons, you need the products that you make from waste to be high value. If you don't, the entire value chain will still be what it is 30 years ago. To give you an example, why has nobody in Singapore invested behind plastics recycling in Singapore? And again, sorry to quote NEA. 20 years ago, for those of you who don't know in Singapore, our recycling rates for plastics were 20%. Last year, it was 6%. And why? Because there was no value creation out of recycling plastics. There was more value creation in throwing into the incinerator to make energy. But if I were to create that value 100x out of waste plastics, then I believe there will be competition for the economic value of prosperity that's been created. Then I think we're talking about moving the needle this way. So I'm just using one example, but I think the summary of it is any products you make out of waste has to command value in order for waste to be equitable. I think that's
yeah. So if the conversation is about not wasting value, and now we are pushing it up to the waste to energy, and again, the same question. I think waste to energy is viable, economic. I mean, it has solved the case. Equitable, Leif, I will ask you whether it's an equitable model. Is it meaningful? Where do you see waste to energy in the midstream playing a role?
I would say that with the alternatives available back in the 80s when they opened the incineration of waste in Singapore, it was a very, very valuable option because at that time the alternative was a landfill, which is no discussion much worse.
Yeah.
Yes.
But these days, you can get so much more out of it. Like you talked about plastic bottles. In Singapore, you have 6% return. In Norway, we have above 90% because there is a small deposit of 50 cents per bottle. And then you get the general public's attention. Kids collect bottles and return them to make money to buy ice cream or whatever. But then you get a completely other attention. And you hardly see any plastic in the incineration. And you see also, because there has to be a financial incentive for the general public. Of course, there's always someone interested in environment. I'm one of them, but like there has to be a financial benefit incentive. Like on I noticed the construction site when I passed here this morning. One container for waste. Plastic, metal, wood, all the construction goes into one container. In Norway, they have 10 containers. They sort the waste at the construction site because the construction company get a huge discount on depositing sorted waste. It's a financial benefit for them to do it. I can use another example that's not on sustainability, but on pollution. in India, there is no financial benefit of cleaning the emission. The taxes for emission of SOx and NOx are less than the cost of installing it. It's not worth it for them. So why should a CEO of a company invest $100 million in emission control, where he gets absolutely no benefit from the government or anyone for using it? Then he will probably be fired if he does.
And just on the viability, because you mentioned as well that definitely it was valuable and viable to have incinerator, because the alternative would have been landfill, and that is by far. But you also mentioned that Singapore came with the first waste to energy infrastructure early on. So we are talking about 20 years ago or more. So there is a retrofitting that also need to happen. Also taking into account what you're saying, that actually you will have to run with probably waste that has a lower calorific value. So is it still viable if you're taking into account the retrofitting?
That is the discussion, and we will have a meeting in Indonesia next month on the topic of retrofitting scrubbers. That's coal-fired power plants, but it's the same topic, and will not be ever positive to retrofit a scrubber at a 40-year-old coal-fired power plant. It will never happen. Then they will demolish it instead. It's too expensive to upgrade it.
Juliana, if we're moving upstream with you and we're thinking that's still equitable, viable, meaningful, I think the eco design, doing things right at the beginning, will probably check them all. Do you see any tension points between equitable, meaningful, viable?
I'd like to go back to Lauren's point about valuing waste as a resource. And really, it's all about the life cycle of a product, right? If you put some value to it, including environmental value, which Lawrence alluded to, I think then we can see the real cost of the product and its byproducts and at the end of life. If we include all of that, then we can then maybe distribute the cost of use of it from the consumer standpoint. And maybe there may be some mechanism for us to make it more equitable from the manufacturer, from the consumers going to use the product, to maybe even the collector who collects that for Lawrence facility to then recycle it. So maybe that's another way of looking at it. So I think for us, life cycle analysis is one way of life cycle of product and where it can distribute it equitably. But to support that, of course, we always need patience, need to have regulatory drivers. And sad to say, without that kind of driver, it's very, very hard to push this kind of circularity thinking. And I think we've seen that with some of the examples that both Lawrence and Leif has mentioned. Without that, basically, we have to always look for bankable projects. And yeah, recycling is always a tough business. And it's always seen as a, sort of a end of life kind of solution rather than it being part of that life cycle.
So if I can stay on the bankable project and make it very concrete for each one of you, in your conversation with your stakeholders, up, mid, downstream, what is coming up as both pain points, or where do you see the engagement goes? What will be conversation that makes a project bankable?
For our customers, it's always ends up with a financial discussion. If the discussion we have now both in India and Indonesia is that, are they going to buy our technology instead of investing in a scrubber or a SCR? Sorry, Ira. It's like we are just two competitors here. But like it's for them, it's like, is our solution cheaper than doing the alternatives, because the demand on reduction of air pollution is coming. But so far, as India has no cost on polluting the air, we're not able to convince them yet, because it has to be bankable. Like if the penalty for pollution is high enough,
Yeah.
then they stop.
Yeah, life before moving to that. Is that something with the time horizon? Do we need to educate the market about a bankable project that is seen over a certain period of time? Is there a need to educate? I mean, it's an open question to all three of you. I mean, definitely we are not costing the externalities. So in India, there is no price to pollute in a way. If you would put a price on it, maybe some other solutions will gain traction. They will be more bankable. But is there something with the way we are defining returns over a certain period of time that makes the project less bankable?
Maybe let me share my perspective, right? Because I mean, we're an SME, so there are more challenges to funding than anybody else. I think the challenge we face today is we are not the poster child of ESG, SDG, COP7. The poster child is how do we solve the energy crisis? So all bankable projects are basically wind turbines, solar panels, hydro dams, even building a pipeline from Laos to Singapore, which I can understand, but it's a long distance. That's where the banks are going to. That's where they are financing it. And whether you look at the taxonomies and all that, that's what they're focused on. What they're not focusing on, which they don't think is bankable at this point in time, because it is not the poster child and because they don't really understand, is waste management. Because it's so downstream that they don't think about it, right? I mean, what you do, I mean, for those of you who live in Singapore, if you live in a condominium, you open your chute, you throw, you don't think about it, right? That's it. Somebody takes it away. I see it. Not in a way, right?
Yeah, no. Well, it's part of there also. Like you throw it in the trash and it's gone.
Yeah, it's gone, right?
Problem gone.
Yeah,
Solved.
I don't think about it. I see it every day, right? So it's very different from me. And actually, what I'm trying to say is that it is not a hot topic at this point. And it's therefore not bankable. I think that's the first part. The second part is patience, right? I don't want to quote history, but I think solar has been around for more than 10 years. I think the technology and the battery is getting way better, and therefore you can store more, and so it becomes bankable. And the investment bankers or the risk analysts, they understand it a lot better, so they're willing to bank it. The challenge, I think, with bankable projects is patience. So I speak to private equity venture capitalists I won't say on a daily basis, but maybe on a weekly basis. We meet many different people. And it's always, when is your exit? Not me, yeah? You ask the private equity, when is your exit? 3 years.
Yeah. That's why my comment about are we looking at a reasonable horizon?
If you ask me from an SME perspective, the answer is no. And even if you're talking about a large enterprise, the answer is no too, because we're just right at the cusp of innovation. We're trying to solve the problem now. So you can throw impact investing and all terminology, sexy terminology in there. The answer is you need at least a decade of investment and patience to see those green shoots turning into even a plant.
Yeah.
Not even a tree.
I will get back to all of you with the investment. But before that, Juliana, what's your view on bankable project? What is Rumble see?
I was just going to say to Lawrence, maybe he should change his company's name to resource management and not waste management. Then maybe you'll get some more people sitting up and say, oh, okay, resource equal to value. So I think that's where I see that there are a lot of opportunities. It could be a win-win, not just planet Earth, but also for the supply chain, to look at waste as more of a resource and how we can change the mindset of everyone, and PEs, to value waste as a resource. And of course, as Lawrence mentioned, yes, the time frame is 3 to almost 5 years, right? We do need funding. The EU has been a very great example of a lot of the countries coming together to fund interesting concepts and piloting them. And that's why you have all these climate action initiatives, which I think we should have a lot to learn from.
Because it's about, are we wasting value? That's the question. What do we understand by waste value? So Leif, if I'm going back to you and thinking about the waste to energy and what you see happening, so the pain points that some of your stakeholders are bringing up, some of your customers, what is their understanding of value?
They are kind of simple souls. They look at waste as a raw materials to be used to produce electricity.
Yeah.
But they see and they understand the need for this value to change, because it's wrong to burn all the paper and cardboard and plastic and whatever it is. It's wrong to do it. It's those resources could be used to so much better. But as it is, with the regulation they have today, with the environment there is today, they have really no alternative. And I have a worse view on time frame than you have, because in my youth I used to work as an FX dealer. That was long term, meant after lunch. But it has to be a combination with legislation. And nothing will really happen until you have changed legislation with some financial consequences. Then something will start to happen. And the 90% return rate of plastic bottles in Norway did not happen overnight.
No, and the reason why I'm asking is because as I'm listening to you, all three of you, downstream, you can educate more about the value, but it takes longer time. As you're moving upstream, I think there is probably less the value will be more comparing what is the alternative. So to your point, it's about feedstock. Is the government of solid waste or city waste compared to other feedstock, is it still a better option? As you're moving upstream, then it's about the business case, what's in for anyone to redesign, rethink, repackage. So we probably have three different definitions of waste. So if we are contextualizing, are we wasting value? Where? So what's your take? I'm just keen because I'm trying to reconcile it for myself, but I think we have different definition of value. And maybe that's where we need to start, trying to figuring out what's the value that we can assign upstream.
If I want to frame it, I think there's a lot of intellectual value we have created, over the last decade. And how we take the intellectual value that we have created and circulate back into whether it's design thinking upstream, midstream, and downstream, and reconcile this, I think is one prevention of waste. It's the first time I'm sitting in a conversation where upstream, midstream, and downstream put it that way. Mostly it's a downstream conversation. So I think that's I think the second is, I think manufacturers need to take some responsibility in this whole value thing. Whether it's incentive or not, I think as long as we're able to bring the end of life to create value, then I think they have some level of responsibility. And I think by doing that, by adding kind of value to the value chain or the supply chain, I think it will create value. And then I think the third is, there's this whole continued innovation behind it, that we need to look at to create more value versus just value on its own, at its current state. So I think creating more value is probably more important than saying that today, just going to create a small incremental value out of the linear economy. But in order for the circular economy to happen, we need to create more value. I think that's how.
Juliana?
I just want to take an example of what we're going on to a more greener society with electrical cars, so going more in and solar panels. How about the end of life of these materials? I think that's one of the things that we not really talk about, because while we are putting a lot of money and investment into solar power, at the end of the day, all these assets will have an end of life, and they will end up either being a resource or they will waste. So I see that there's an opportunity here for business to rethink what we're going to do with these so-called green products, right? Because at the end of the day, we still need to feed. So I think the thinking of that circular economy, which I talked about, is very key in how we value resource. Because the resource extraction industry contributes to at least 50% of global CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
And they cause 90% of biodiversity loss. But we don't actually put a value to that biodiversity loss. But if you go to any ESG forums or ESG or PEAC meetings, everyone's talking about biodiversity accounting. Everyone wants to invest in biodiversity. So how do you connect that to all your green technology, to how you would then treat those assets once it's identified? I think that conversation of linking all these three together is to come together. And I agree with you. It's seldom that we have this kind of forum where we have this opportunity to speak as like in the circle, right?
Yeah.
But if taking from the Nordics experience, I think 2 decades ago, how did they come and arrive at this situation that they have such high recycling rates, they have very green economy? It's because 2 decades ago, my colleagues tell me in Denmark, they actually have this stakeholder engagement of all precisely this industry players, recyclers, waste treatment operators, and regulators, as well as engineers and scientists. And they sat together and they worked this through, and they did pilot studies and they did more. And I think today, I guess you can say that the Nordics are a very good example of a very circular economy. They're getting better here. So I think these are the conversations we need to have. We'll be able to do more of that in the future. So that's how I see it. Trying to make it more bankable.
Yeah. Thanks. And staying with the banks and the value and investment as you're meeting PEs and alike. Challenging now the three of you a bit and provoking. If you should invest, would you invest in value upstream, midstream, downstream? So Juliana, let's start upstream. Where would you put your money?
Anything that saves the biodiversity of our planet. Absolutely.
And that will be mainly upstream at the source. Right.
Of course, I should say midstream, but I think I agree with you that it's better to create less waste. Sorry to say that.
No, I agree, because I think upstream is the root of the challenge, right, that we are creating. So I think investing in the upstream is the right thing to do, while watching that downstream and the midstream at the same time.
Well, there will always be consumption. So solutions that our engineers in waste to energy to recycling are a very important part of the solution. Whether we like it, there will be people who like fast fashion, the next automobile, next gadget. If I think about it in Singapore, I was a little bit shocked that we produced 60,000 tons of electronic waste. This is 5 years ago. And each one of us generates 11 kilograms of e-waste a year. I was thinking iPhones. That's what, 60, 70 iPhones per person per year. Amazing amount of waste for a nation. Yes. So it can only be going upwards, right? As population grow, as our aspirations to be more affluent.
Yeah.
So where do we find solutions? As us, trying to convince our stakeholders to be more responsible in their consumption, to be more sustainable.
Thank you. Let's open the floor. Any questions from the audience? Anything around this? Are we wasting value? Equitable, meaningful, viable? And again, upstream, midstream, downstream is a unique chance to track the waste and where is the value? Any questions? Any burning questions?
Element of business case over there is also, and I just read the report from ADB, the newest one, where that the incentives and the subsidies are very much still allocated towards fossil fuels and all these more classical forms of energy at the moment. And just shifting that into renewables, that would make all the difference into reaching the climate targets. How do you see that happening or not happening in your industry and in Singapore, especially at this stage?
Thanks for your question. Any viewpoints? Lawrence, you want to give a start? Let's move Singapore, then we go Norway, and then we go a bit international.
Yeah, I probably want to say, like, you know, the way the attention span, right? I'm sorry, maybe how the attention is given upstream, downstream. I think it's still very much upstream to downstream. So for me, I'm still getting the last attention. I'm like not even the third child. I'm like the step child. So I mean, that's my viewpoint. My viewpoint is I think there are more immediate issues, you know, to solve. Whether it's, I don't think, I mean, in general, I don't think humans will, we have what we call the oil curse. You know, we cursed ourselves basically for the last century. I don't think we can get out of that quite quickly.
Like, do you have the same, not being a child type of family belonging in Norway?
But like it's right that regulation do take, and just thinking of the fact that the waste to energy power plants here in India, or in Singapore, are funded by tip fees, which means that the collections system is paid to bring as much waste as possible to the waste incineration. So if they start segregation, they lose money. So for them, it's a value having as much waste as possible.
Yeah, so they will compete.
Yeah.
To secure that feedstock.
Yeah, but also those doing the collection of waste.
Yes.
They want to maximize the volume, of course. And they are the one that could have done the segregation, but they're not.
Juliana, any education advice? Engagement.
I guess I get engagement and also the upcoming, extended producer responsibility act regulations that are coming up for beverage container return would be a good start. I know that in the EU they are looking at vehicles as well as textiles. That's the next step, beyond just the usual e-waste and the bottles and the plastics and the packaging. So I think this is something that we can also look at in terms of be more ambitious in what we would do to extend the producer responsibility.
Yeah, so we don't need 11 iPhones at home in the future.
Depending on how many kids you have at home.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? We still have some time.
Yes, comment. What I found very interesting in Europe, and this is actually more about climate change than much waste, is when the war happened in Ukraine. And of course, Europe couldn't get gas anymore from Russia. How incredible change of mindset. Because there's so much people start to really reduce their gas consumption without actually so much reducing quality of life. So it was actually possible. So that mindset change, it required a shock. And I think that nobody would have expected that Europe is nearly independent with respect to gas from Russia. So that type of shock in the system, I think you also need for upstream type of thinking. Well, and if we think about overall health, yeah. So you talk about the beverages and things like that. Like in New York, I think they are going to abolish that you have the big gulp. You cannot drink the big gulp. That will reduce waste as well and overall health of the community. So I think big shock and legislation can make a huge difference. But legislation, you can have legislation, but you also need enforcement. Yeah. Like in Indonesia, if they would now change legislation, that doesn't mean that it will be enforced. So you also need strong enforcement.
Thanks.
Just a comment. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing your reflection. Remy, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Now, thank you very much for the panelists. And I wanted to ask a generic question in relation to EPR, extended producer responsibility. Lawrence, and I think Juliana also, you were mentioning about the responsibility of the upstream side of the industry to improve the use of resources and minimize waste. And there have been like many extended producer responsibility framework around the world, sometimes as old as 40 years ago already. And many of them in Europe and also in Asia. Now, the recycling rate in those countries is better than Singapore, but not that amazing. Still a lot to be improved on. And I wanted to ask you if you were, in principle, in favor of EPR schemes in Singapore to force industry to move in a specific direction. And if so, are you also in favor of very strict regulation that limit what industry can actually do? For example, in South Korea, any colored PET bottle is bad. You can only have transparent plastic bottles. But you can go a lot further in how you design your schemes. And I was a bit curious about what would be your view on this, if you would be more in favor of freedom for the industry to try whatever they can, or actually be limited to whatever is strictly necessary.
Maybe I'll go first. I think in Singapore, we always look to other countries, what they do. And if it's a tried and tested technology that works, and if companies can reimagine, remanufacture their products, why can't it be in Singapore? We're supposed to be best in class, right? In terms of our service and our products. So I think, yeah, I would like to see that happen. Bearing in mind, I think that what Singapore does well is the transition period. It's not something that we can do overnight, because it would just hurt a lot of industries and also the economy, because we are such a big manufacturing base as well for high-end goods. But I think it's something that I would really like to see, because if it's, why not? We should have higher ambitions. We should strive greener.
Any other?
I think EPRs are a good thing. I think it spreads the responsibility across. I think what I'm hoping is upstream, they don't pass the cost back to the consumer. I think that's the fear I have, because then inflation happens, etc., etc. I think they need to take that responsibility. So I think it's a good thing. Now, with regards to the other part, where you should be looking at end of life as part of your product design up front, I think that again is extremely important as well. I'd like to share a story, and I won't quote the company. They came to visit us, and I asked them the question. I said, which do you think is more recyclable, your hard plastics or your soft refillable soap kind of plastics? They don't have an answer. And those are the people who are in command of the company. My answer to them is the hard bottles have more value and will get recycled versus the soft.
Yeah.
So why are you doing that to yourself and to the environment? And I think it's an educational process apart from regulatory controls. So that's my my quick response. But I think to Juliana's point, Singapore is a little bit hard to govern I say that for a reason, because we are an import country. So unless we decide that, you know what, I'm not going to import from China, I'm only going to import from Europe, then we follow the European standards.
Yeah.
Then I think there's some value that we can, environmental value we can create as part of that, or even Korea, for example. But it's hard, I think, for Singapore. So I think Singapore really needs to look at its infrastructure, sorting, segregation. I think that would be important. The midstream is important as well.
Better value for your waste.
Yes,
When it gets to
correct.
One last question, mindful of time, sorry, but I think this is really interesting. And because it's the first time we have upstream, midstream, downstream, each one of you, very shortly, Juliana, if you should speak to your midstream, downstream, what would you tell them around waste management? Same for you, Life. If you're looking up and you're looking down, what would be your advice? What would be your action that you will take? And Lawrence, you know, you will have to go the whole way bottom up. What would it be? So 1, 2 things that you will share as your advice, talking to the one below or above.
I would like to have this kind of conversations. I'd like to bring together the manufacturer, the regulator, the downstream, the midstream. Let's sit together, see what the possibilities are and what the pain points are. Of course, that's a more grander scale, but I think it's something that we must have.
Yeah.
Whether it's within a small community or a more larger community to do this kind of discussions, I think there's value in it.
Life, what would be your ask upstream and your advice downstream?
I'll follow Lawrence a little bit because it's for me, as my head is more on the poisonous side of waste, and that is the manufacturer should know and be responsible for choosing less polluting raw materials to produce when it goes to waste, if it's landfill or incineration or whatever you use it, it's when it's creating hydrochloric acid, like the awful waste is if you can use other raw materials with almost the same benefits, you should choose that. And at least you should know the difference.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you get your attention? So what is your scream for?
I think there is a need for the downstream to talk to the upstream and go, you need to help me as much as I'm going to help you. Right? You need to help me to make products which I can turn into other products that we can recycle or recirculate much easier. Because if you make it difficult for me, it's going to be hard for me to do it. And if I don't do it, then we are in trouble. Yeah. So
We go to life.
yeah.
Juliana, Life, Lawrence, thank you so much. I think please help me giving a hand. And I will bring it back to Aneta. You mentioned that someone is saying that recycling is like mindfulness, that you almost find peace with yourself. I think the conversation today was really trying to highlight some of the trade-offs, because as we're moving upstream, midstream, downstream, and you know, the conversation we have had today was really meant to highlight some of the tensions that you will have. But again, I took away from this conversation a few things. I think there is a higher competition for waste, and hence the conversation about how do we put the value on that waste. And eventually, Lawrence, you probably are the one that can show how much more value you can get. And that is probably helping then accelerating things at upstream in terms of eco-design. I'm curious to follow what will happen on the incinerator side of things, because while it's still a viable solution, it will be really interesting to see what will be the value, whether we see a diminishing value or we are seeing an increased value. And I think, Life, your perspective about calorific value and what will need to happen in order to generate the same amount of power, I think was quite interesting. So thank you so much, all three of you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and Nordic Innovation House, and thank you.